Hello and welcome to Lady Dynamite Creates. This is Tiffany, and today I'm going to show you how I created Azzy the Lust Demon. We have so much ground to cover today that I'm going to skip over the prep stuff. I've shown this in other videos, so feel free to check out any of my other ones for more detailed instructions. I chose Draculaura as my base, then I shaved down her hair with my electric razors, put her head down into some boiling water to soften the vinyl to easily remove it. I scraped out the plugs with a flathead screwdriver and removed them with my needle nose pliers, then using 100% acetone removed all of her factory paint. After all that's done, we can jump right into all of the prep onto the body. We're going to be doing lots of sculpting, so we need to get a nice clean canvas to work with. I'm completely sanding her body, and I'm using my X-Acto to scrape down the seams. I use my Dremel to help me remove the molded on panties, but this just helps me remove the bulk, and I still do need to sand afterwards. Once she's completely sanded, I'm going to bust out the Apoxie Sculpt so that I can start making her a bit more curvy. I follow the package directions and mix up equal parts of A and B. The directions do say to wear gloves while you're mixing, but it doesn't mention when sculpting if you still need to wear those gloves. I don't. I find it easier to sculpt without them, but I do know from experience I have not had any kind of allergic reaction, so if you don't wear gloves, that's your own risk. I begin sculpting her breasts, and I am using water to help smooth out any of the edges. I pay close attention to the areas where the epoxy meets the plastic because those are the areas that are going to be the most noticeable if you don't have a smooth transition. I did look at lots of reference to make sure that I got an appropriate weight and balance to the breasts. They will have a different weight and shape depending on the type of garment and support that they provide, so that is something that you need to think about when you're sculpting. Something as simple as just using reference can help you grow so much as an artist. While I'm sculpting, I have to be careful to keep the two sides separate because they are wanting to form into one giant uniboob and continually define the space between the breasts. It is important when you're sculpting to check all the other angles as well. You want it to look good from the sides and the top, not just from the front. I am going to apologize for any barking you hear in the video, but the neighbors that live behind me got a dog, and that's all it seems to do. I did want to take a moment to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. I really appreciate you guys so much. Kelly Barnard, Camille, Kitsy, Stormcrow Studios, Donna Magana, Bex Mini Studio, OOAK Magpie. If you are interested in becoming one of my patrons, please check the link down in the description box. My patrons get first dibs on all doll purchases, as well as access to exclusive video content, in-process and behind-the-scenes photos, participation in polls. Certain tiers receive sewing patterns and 3D prints. This month's Dynamite tier received a new style of 3D printed shoes that will be coming to my Etsy store pretty soon. When I'm happy with the sculpting, I leave this to cure for 24 hours before I move on to any other body modifications. I wanted her to have ungully gray legs like a goat, and I figured this would be the perfect use for some of those old doll legs from where I've made mermaids. I've marked on her legs and on the extra set of legs where I would like to cut them off, and I'm going to use my Dremel diamond bit cutoff wheel and cut these apart. This is my first time doing a big body mod, and I was utterly terrified. Prior to this, all of my big body mods had always been mermaids, and I just felt like mermaids were a little bit easier for me to tackle. So this was pushing me outside my comfort zone, and I really wanted to tackle something big this year, and so this was it. I think during the month of January, I practically binge watched every satyr, fawn, and dragon video there was on YouTube. The big thing that I did want to tackle was I wanted to make sure I was adding in an extra joint, but I also wanted to try to incorporate some of these doll parts that I had laying around, so that's why I chose to use the extra set of legs I had. Over the years of accumulating my stock box, I have gotten a fair amount of broken dolls and just parts, so I want to start using some of those up. Once I have these all separated, I'm going to drill out holes into each piece, use some wire to connect them, and glue them together. I didn't have a thick enough wire, so I'm doubling this up and twisting it together to create a thicker piece. I'm using super glue for the initial hold, but I do go back and reinforce these with 2-part epoxy glue. However, I did have to do this outside because everyone gets mad if I do stinky stuff in the house, because you know it's toxic. Because I want to be able to build up my own musculature on her legs, I am going to thin down this plastic some, and I am making sure that I make the two areas where they meet the same width so that there's not this huge ledge where it just suddenly drops off. I use a sanding wheel on my Dremel to get the bulk of it off. At this point, I decided I didn't like how upright she was standing. It seemed less of like goat leg haunches and more of just she was upright and leaning forward. So I'm going to change the angle on the area right above her knee. I'm just cutting that off. Then I'm going to drill a hole through the bottom portion and then feed that up to the top. I pull it forward to a slightly more downward angle and glue it in place. Now to start the sculpting on the legs. I am going to do this in multiple passes, but on this first pass, I'm really just trying to cover up these seams and then make sure that there's a smooth transition from my epoxy to the plastic. I use lots of water on my hands while I'm sculpting because this is going to help me smooth out the epoxy. And let's face it, I need that epoxy as smooth as possible at this stage because I hate sanding and I know I'm still going to have to sand, so let's just make my job a little bit easier and not have to sand as much. Now for some of that sanding. I do sand after every layer of epoxy I add because if I'm adding lumps at this stage, the next layer of epoxy is just going to intensify that lump. So might as well get it out of the way now so that I'm not creating more problems for myself at the very end. Now onto her hooves. I had decided early on I wanted her lower half to be more goat-like, so I wanted to give her the split hooves. I felt like Azzy's personality would be very curious and inquisitive, but she would be very headstrong and just difficult to deal with in general, very stubborn, so I felt like this was a good reflection on her goat-like physiology. Plus, there's the added boon that demonic creatures are typically shown with goat-like attributes. Once the hooves are fully cured, I begin adding on some more bulk to her legs, and I'm building up this back ridge here, and then I'm going to be adding in her dew claw. I know goats have a vestigial dew claw, and I imagine since she is someone who still actively hunts, she would actually use hers and they would help her hold on to her prey. So hers are sharp and pointy so she can get her claws into her victim and they can't get away. I sculpted the claws and let them cure ahead of time so that when I'm ready to apply them, I just sink them down into some softer clay. This gives the look of the nail bed coming up around the claw itself. Alright, I'm done with all the sculpting, she's cured, I've done all the sanding, I'm going to finally do a final round of polishing to all of her parts. I'm using a 3M Scotch polish wheel, and this is actually meant to use to polish metal jewelry and metalsmithing, and I just thought to give it a try to see how well it would do on the epoxy and plastic, and it actually works really, really well. I will leave a link to these in the description box. So I'm just using it to give everything a nice smooth finish. It's what I plan to use here on out to get rid of like the molded panties and the factory marks on the dolls, because I'll show you a close-up right here just how easily it pulls it off and doesn't damage the plastic at all. Before I move on, I do spray her with a gray primer, and this is just going to show any imperfections that I need to correct before I want to go on to my painting stage. And you can see right here, there is a little bit of a seam where those two meet. So I do go in with another layer of epoxy right there just to fix that spot. I highly recommend doing this step and not skipping it, because when you're working with the epoxy and it's a different color than the plastic, you're going to miss areas that you just don't notice that there's imperfections because it's not one solid color. Once you start painting, these things are going to come to light. I'm sculpting her tail and horns out of C4 foam clay from TNT Cosplay Supply. For the base of the tail, I'm using a wire, and I'm just scuffing it up to help the foam clay adhere it just a little easier. I smush it down into the clay and try to make sure that I'm keeping it in the center of that, and then trying to roll out a taper. I'm not going to be perfect because keeping it in the direct center of the clay was a little difficult. I'm just making an approximation of the shape that I want, and I'll shave it down later. I use water on my fingers to smooth out some of the more egregious areas. I'll leave some of the wire sticking out the bottom. This will allow me to attach it to the doll later on. I begin to sculpt her horns, and I first roll out a ball shape and cut this in half. This way I have equal portions for both horns. I roll out a cone, and then I'm going to take and dip the bottom of it into water and then apply it to the doll's head. The water is just going to make the foam clay a little bit sticky so that it sticks easier to the plastic while I'm working and shaping. All in all, I sculpted 4 horns, 2 small ones for the front and 2 larger ones from the back. While I had the clay out, I did just sculpt a whole bunch and then just decided on the ones that I liked best. I leave the clay to dry out for the next 48 hours. You want to make sure that it is completely dry and hardened before you start doing any kind of sanding to it. Once I'm certain that it's fully dried and safe to sand, I pull out my Dremel and begin sanding down the tail. I want a nice taper on this, so I'm wanting the tip to be pretty thin and then the base be a little bit thicker. Be sure to wear a respirator mask anytime you're doing any kind of sanding because you don't want that stuff getting in your lungs. Now I'm going to be adding a couple of coats of Flexbond. Flexbond is a primer that you're supposed to use for Warbler, but it's also used for EVA foam, and I highly recommend it anytime you're working with foam clay because although foam clay is supposed to be just like EVA foam, it's not. And it is more brittle, and so sometimes after it dries out, if you try to bend it, it's just going to tear it and break it. This Flexbond prevents that from happening. It also seals the foam and prevents it from just soaking up paint, otherwise you're going to be doing a million coats of paints on these things. I coat both the tail and the horns with this. And here you can see, no Flexbond, wonk wonk, it tore. Flexbond, woohoo! Success! Let's give this girl some color. I'm starting with her tail and I'm base painting it out pink, and this is a pink that I've just color matched to Draculaura's skin tone. Then that's going to transition to a purple and then a black at the tip. I wanted her to have a little tuft of hair at the end of her tail, so I've brushed out some black yarn and created wefts, and using some hot glue I apply it to the tip of her tail and then wrap those wefts around. Once I get it as long as I want it, I'm going back in with some flocking that I've created out of yarn, and I'm going to flock the area just to cover up that transition, to try to make it look a little bit nicer from skin to fur. I apply Mod Podge and put the flocking directly on that, and once the glue is dried, I can dust off the excess. For her large horns, I'm giving them a coat of black paint with pink tips. Then once that's dry, I'm going to coat them in Dragonfly Glaze and give them a glossy top coat. Her small horns get a glossy black paint job. Her body received the same treatment as the tail, however my camera battery went dead when I was painting it, so I got no footage of that. I color matched the top half of her body to the Draculaura skin tone and then painted the bottom portion gradient purple to black. Since I already have my airbrush out, I decided to give her some blushing with it too. I'm using a slightly darker version of her skin tone, and I'm going to begin doing some shading. I'm just shading down the center of her back, in between any crevices, and on her sides. I like to think of just what area would naturally have shadow in it. Once I'm finished with all of my airbrushing, I take her outside and give her 3 coats of Krylon spray varnish. I want to reduce the risk as chipping as much as possible. The spray varnish does leave her pretty glossy, but I had planned to do some body blushing with pastels as well, so I've given her 2 coats of Mr. Super Clear, and then I'm going to hop in with the pastels. I'm using some white pastel to pop her highlights, and then I'm bringing in some other colors as well, some shades of pinks and browns, just to give the dimension to her shadows. I'm using a pinkish brown watercolor pencil to detail out some of the lines and creases in her hands, and I'm using my own hands for reference on where to draw things. I'm also blending out some of the shadows with some pastels. I give her joints a blushing of bright pink pastel. I finish off her body blushing with a copious amount of mica powder. I'm using a amethyst purple color on her legs and an iridescent pink on the top half. I fill all of this in with 2 coats of Mr. Super Clear. I also apply a layer of dragonfly glaze to her hooves and dew claw. I'm going to apply some of that same fur that we'd applied to her tail to her hooves, and I'm beginning by first razoring this down shorter just to make it easier for application. So I'm just taking my razor blade and running it down and trimming off some of those excess hairs. This allows it to still have a nice taper. I apply hot glue directly to the weft itself and then lay it onto the hoof in rows. I've flocked the area underneath between the dew claw and the top of the hoof, and I'm just going to be laying these wefts down in rows on just the top portion. Once I reach the area that I'm happy with, I'm going to flock this top area just like we did on the tail. I use my razor and my scissors to very carefully shape the fur. Every demon girl needs a fabulous manicure, so let's give her one. I've taken and cut slivers of cardstock down, and I'm just matching these up with the same width of a finger, and I'm going to curve one end and then using some super glue this to her hand. I use my tweezers to squeeze tightly to make sure I've got good contact with the paper and the finger. Once I have all of the nails on, I'm using my scissors to cut them down to length and then giving them a nice taper. I apply UV resin clear hard type to the top and to the underneath of the nails. I then set it with a UV lamp and then paint them black. I was a little torn on her look at first, and my sketches were ranging from pastel goth to just overtly sexy dominatrix stuff. And I ultimately landed on pastel goth because I felt like that was just a cuter direction to go for a lusty demon girl. My favorite design was this one with the cutoff shorts, the harness bra, the sheer mesh top, and the crop jacket. So with keeping that in mind, let's move on to her clothes. We're going to start with the cutoffs first, and I'm frayed checking my pieces here with the exception of the seam at the leg hole because I do want them to be frayed there. On the 2 front pieces, I'm clipping the curves around the pockets, and then I'm using some fabric fusion glue to hem those down. I used my mini iron to heat set those in place. I line up the top and the side edge of the pocket backing and the fronts of the shorts so that the lines continue to form the complete front. These pockets don't actually function, they just have the illusion of a pocket there now. I initially tack it into place using some fabric fusion glue, but this is just helping hold it still so that I can do that decorative stitching line. Once I have those pieces together, I can turn them right side spacing and sew up the front seam. I've chosen to use some yellowish gold thread so that these have the accent stitching just like real jeans have. When you're sewing these tight curves, be sure to go slowly and to constantly adjust the needle so that you don't get any sharp angles and you get a nice smooth curve. With the pieces sewn together, I use my lighter to singe down the threads short, being careful not to scorch my fabric, and I'm going to flatten those front seams. Flattening your seams when you're sewing doll scale stuff is just a good habit to have because this reduces the amount of bulk that you're creating. I begin to work on my front waistband, and because my shorts are going to lace up the sides, I don't need this to go all the way around, so I have just the two pieces, and I'm going to make them overlap so that they look like a real buttoning set of jeans. I have one side that's slightly longer than the other, and I first sketch out my seam allowances, and I'm going to cut my corners off. This way when I fold these areas over to hem them, that I'm not creating double bulk in the corners. You'll see once I fold these under and hem them, they're going to meet at an angle rather than overlap. I'm pinning these along the waistline, and I'm first pinning down the one that's a little bit longer, and that's because this one is the one that has the hemmed center seam. Now that it's attached, I'm going to add in my decorative stitching. I first sew on the bottom layer and just sew 2 parallel lines, and when I sew the top layer sewing the box on it, I'm using that stitch to help secure the flap in place. I wanted her shorts to fit very tightly, but I also knew that her hooves weren't going to fit through a pair of tight shorts. So the way I designed these shorts was to have them lace up on the sides. This way I can have the laces loosened when I pull them on and then just tighten them once I get them onto her body. But I need to have finished edges to do that, so I'm going to fold these sides over and hem them. Now I can get started on the back side of the shorts, and I'm just putting these 2 back pieces right sides together and sewing up the back seam. When I have those together, I'm flattening out the seam allowance. I sew 2 rows of decorative stitching down the sides of that seam. The fabric that I'm using is actually from a set of my daughter's old jeans. Using kids' clothes is a great way to repurpose fabric, so always check out your thrift store. The children's denim is actually really thin and still has the look of denim and a little bit of stretch too, so it's perfect for sewing doll scale stuff. I hem the top edge of the back waistband, and I'm making sure to clip the curves around this as well, just so that it folds down easier. I attach the back waistband to the back of the pants. Then when that's sewn in place, I add in the decorative stitching and then sew back to front at the crotch seams. I also hem the back side seams. Time to fray these bad boys. I'm taking my seam ripper and I'm just sliding these down along the edges of the fibers, just giving it a nice fray. I don't really have to worry about any of my seams coming loose because when I was flattening all of my seam allowances and hemming my edges, I was also applying bits of fabric glue. Now to get these sides laced up together. The first time I did it with embroidery floss, and I decided I just didn't like the look of it as much, so I do go back later with some ribbon. You can actually buy ribbon embroidery needles. They have a bigger eye on them so that it allows you to thread the needle a little bit easier. Using Gem Tack glue, I began applying nail art studs to look like rivets and buttons in the jeans. I did decide to add back pockets to these shorts as well, but I didn't record it because I was too lazy to unlace the shorts, and it was just hard to show what I was doing. Now to get started on her bra harness. I've got the band cut out as well as the bra cups, and I'm first going to sew up these V-shaped darts on the bra cups and attach them to the band. I trim the excess off the cups after sewing the dart. I flattened out the sides of a jump ring, and I'm going to attach those to the top of the bra cups. I attached 2 ribbons to the other side of the jump ring. I've sewn a snap button onto the bra band, and I'm going to put this onto the doll. I'm going to arrange my 2 ribbon straps and then just place them onto the back band where I want and then tack them in place. But I do need this on the doll just to see how long and where to place them. And then that completes her harness. Now onto her jacket, and I'm working with satin, so of course that means lots of fraying, so lots of fray check. I fray check all the edges on the satin pieces. One thing to remember when using fray check is it can stain certain fabrics, so you want to make sure just to get it at the very edges and not use too much. I sew together the two outside edges on the collar piece. I trim the excess and clip the curves, and then I flip this right side out. I'm using a pointy tool to make sure that I push those edges all the way out. I hem one side of the cuffs, and then I attach them to the sleeves. I use a lighter to singe down the tiny bits of thread. I attach the collar to the neck hole and the sleeves to the armhole. I almost forgot to hem down the front edges, so do that before you attach the collar. When I'm attaching the collar to the jacket, I'm making sure to find the center points on both the neck hole and on the collar piece, and starting there first, then working my way around. This will ensure the collar is evenly placed. I've sewn 2 gathering threads onto the top of the sleeve. This wasn't necessary because there's not much of a gather there, but it does make it a little bit easier to apply the sleeve to the armhole. When you're sewing gathering threads, it is important to do a longer stitch. Try to do about a 4, maybe a 4.5. Even on doll scale stuff, it's hard to gather because of the thread density. One mistake I used to make early on was I always just tried to get away with just sewing 1 gathering thread, and that's just not going to cut it. The reason for having 2 gathering threads is so when you pull the fabric, it's not winding itself around in a circle on the single line of thread. So it turns out, even though I made these clothes specifically for a doll that I sculpted, they just so happened to fit the big sister body type. So I digitized all of these patterns, and I'm making them available for free for all of my patrons tier cherry bombing up. I remove any of the visible gathering stitches. With right side spacing, I sew up the sides and the armholes. My collar kept trying to flop over the wrong way, so I'm top stitching the seam allowance. I attach a decorative zipper to the jacket. I unfortunately didn't have any doll scale separating zippers, so this is not functional, it's just for looks. I hem the bottom and side edges of the band of the jacket, and then I'm going to attach this to the bottom of the jacket. With that, her outfit's done, and I really love it, guys. It's so cute. We're gonna head down to what used to be my kitchen to custom dye some yarn for her hair. Yep, half my kitchen is still missing. The joys of dealing with insurance companies. I'm using Rit Dye More for synthetic fabrics in the color Graphite, and I'm using a pan that I only use for dyeing. I heat it on the stove, and then I take the previously prepared yarn fibers and dip just the tips. I left this in for about 15 minutes. When working with dye, I highly recommend wearing gloves because this stuff will stain your hands for a very long time. Also, make sure you keep things nearby that you don't mind getting ruined. So if you want to use paper plates or just have old towels and things around to collect spills and clean up. It was at this point that I realized I didn't have a sink I could rinse this off in. I couldn't rinse it off in the bathroom because the dye would stain the ceramic. So I took it outside and rinsed it off with the hose pipe and just kept rinsing until all of the water coming off of it was clear. I then brought it inside and let it dry completely. With the hair completely dry, I flat iron it on a low heat setting to prepare it for rerooting. Before I can reroot the head, I do need to mark where her horns are going to go, so I temporarily place the horns on and mark them with a pencil. I'm just using some double-sided tape to help hold them in place. I then give her scalp a coat of black acrylic paint. To reroot, I gather up a small amount of the yarn fiber and then sliding it onto the needle. I then plunge this down into the doll's head. I'm rerooting just the gray tips to give her a nice balayage. Because yarn fibers are thicker, you don't have to reroot every hole like you do with nylon hair, so I'm rerooting about every other hole along her hairline. I fill in the open spaces with about every 3 or 4 holes. I do make sure to give her good coverage right around the horns though. Because she has horns, I don't give her a center part. I plan to just have the hair sweeping backwards there. With her head fully rerooted, I'm going to use some liquid fusion glue and stuff this down into the neck hole and then swirl it around, making sure I'm touching all of those plugs. We want to make sure that this hair is nice and secured. Now onto her face up. These are all of the products that I used in the course of her face up. However, I did forget to show the mica powders. If you are interested in the products that I use, I always have a list of them in the description box below. If you ever have any questions, feel free to send me a message or just leave a comment down below. I've prepped the doll with 2 layers of Mr. Super Clear UV Cut Flat, and then I begin sketching on her face. I begin by sketching in her eyes, and I'm using this Faber Castell Aquarelle Art Grip pencil. Sorry, that's a mouthful. To sketch with. I've gotten to where I really like to use this particular pencil when I'm doing face-ups that this color will show up on because it blends very nicely with the waterline. This time around I did decide to draw the pupils a little bit larger than I normally do. I figured since she is a lust demon and dilated pupils is a sign of arousal, I thought it would be fitting for her character. I give her face a complete dusting of my colorless blender and then I begin shading in her face. I darken the areas around her eyes, nose, and mouth, and inside her ears as well. I'm using shades of browns and pinks to shade her face out. These are the same colors that I used on her body because I don't want there to be a visual difference. A lot of times when I'm working on a face up, I'm just sitting there thinking like, oh, gotta trust the process, trust the process. I know it looks like crap right now. It's gonna look good in the end. This one never actually went through that. I was so surprised that I was so happy with the face the entire time I was working on it. Around the areas on her forehead where her horns begin, I am blushing those in different shades of purples and pinks. I use a small amount of bright red to blush her cheeks. When I was looking up the pastel goth makeup aesthetic, I quickly decided I wanted her to have dramatic eyes, but a black lip. I felt like that would be a very stark contrast to the very pale pink of her skin tone. I blushed this color on with my pastels. This will allow me to still go in with pencils to give some defining lines because my pencils are darker than my pastels. I darken up her eyeliner with my black watercolor pencil, and then I give her a coat of Mr. Super Clear and Seal to start the next layer. I start off layer 2 with jumping right into her eyebrows, and because I feel like this girl's got a sassy attitude, I needed to show on her face. I sketch out one of her eyebrows raised because I feel like she might be up to something. I use gray pastels to get a general shape, and then I refine it with my pencil eraser. I use a brighter red to define the tear ducts in the corners of the eye. I pump up the blushing on her cheeks just a tiny bit, and then I begin to make that eyeshadow more dramatic, more swooping grays and blacks across the eye. I'm using my black watercolor pencil to add in some of those detail lines to the lips. I decided to give her purple eyes to tie that more closely in with her color story, and I block in those colors. I darken up her pupils, and then I fill in her scleras with my white watercolor pencil. While I have my white pencil out, I start adding in some of the various highlights to her face. I get her sealed with another coat of Mr. Super Clear and get started on layer 3. Right away I decided that I felt like something was missing on her face, and I felt like she would be really cute with just a couple of teeth poking through, so I'm using some of my whitewash paint and then just defining out the teeth shape. I add in some detail lines to what little bit of iris is showing there in her eyes, just different shades of white and purple. I give her a small amount of freckles, dusting her nose and cheeks. That was just something that I noticed in the pastel goth aesthetic that just kept coming up. Using some blue-gray pastel, I'm going to shade the top of her eye. This is just going to give it a rounder feel. Using a very sharp watercolor pencil, I begin adding in the individual hairs to her eyebrow. I'm making sure to draw these on in the direction that the hair grows. I'm using some white pastel to highlight areas of her face. I begin to draw in her eyelashes, and I'm using a very sharp hard-leaded pencil to do this, and I find that the freer I am with this, the better my eyelashes look. When I try to be too controlled, my lines get a little wobbly or chunky. I darken up her eyeliner and the bases of her eyelashes with my Derwent Inktense pencil. This is just the darkest black that I have, so it makes a really intense and rich color. Of course, if you're going for that sinfully seductive look, you need beauty marks, so I went a little ham and added a few on there. Finally, I add in her catch lights and her highlights to her waterline. I finished her off with a copious amount of mica powder, and then I give her a final seal with 3 layers of Mr. Super Clear. We are on the final stretch and the end is in sight. We're now going to start styling her hair, and I wanted to style her hair before I attached her horns. So I'm taking small sections of hair and I'm going to spritz them a little bit with hairspray, then I'm going to wrap them around this heated knitting needle that I have, and I'm also going to be using heating elements to help set it in place. I know I may be handling this piece of hot metal like it's nothing, but it is very hot, so you do need to be careful when you do this. I think just all the years of burning myself with hot glue has just made my fingers not as sensitive. Now I can finally add her horns. I have painted the spots where they go black, and I'm using some super glue to just set those in place. The small ones I do before I attach her head, but the big ones I was worried I would damage while trying to put the head on, so I put the head back on the body and then I attach those. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching, and if you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I know this was one of my longer videos. There was just a whole lot to cover in this video, and I appreciate you sticking with me to the end and watching it. At the time this video goes live, she will be available for purchase on my Etsy store, so if you're interested, please check out the link in the description box. Stay till the end for some final photos. Remember, always be creating!